coming to the forefront with regards to the flashpoint in India, in the Himalayan borders. I mean, is this something that we should be looking out for, a new flashpoint for the world?
Yes, certainly. I would say the China-India border, very sadly, has become a flashpoint, new flashpoint for the world. But you have to understand it in terms of the larger geopolitical game that is being played, because the larger contest is between United States and China, as you just said in your report. And it's in that context that I think what is explained the brittleness in the Sino-Indian relationship is what you call a fallout also from the US-China geopolitical contest, because if China perceives India to be moving closer to the US, and then it gets more suspicious, and then things get worse at the border. So you have to see the overall larger geopolitical context where everything is related.
The larger picture is also a China on the rise. Does it mark the end of China's peaceful rise?
You know, it's hard to give you good news, but I would say that China is becoming more assertive, as I document in my book, Has China Won? But China is not becoming aggressive. I think it's very important to emphasize the difference between the two. And as you know, the one consolation about what happened at the China-India border is that no shots were fired. So both sides have adhered to a very strict discipline that they will not fire guns at each other. And so we have to deal with a stronger, more muscular China. But I think that China will do its best to avoid any kind of military conflict. And if you want to be fair, China is the only member of the UN Security Council that has not fought a war in 40 years and actually hasn't fired a bullet across its border in 30 years. So that China, of course, there's a deeper reason for this, by the way. There's a deeper reason because the Chinese believe that the best way to become a great power is to do so without fighting wars.
Kishore, it's Rishaad. The thing is this the point also, a turning point? Because we've got this so-called Quad. We're talking about India, the United States, Australia and Japan. Now, this action in India, on the Indian border, does this push India further into the US camp? Does also the rather vitriolic language between Australia and China push Australia firmly back into the American camp as well? So is this solidifying positions in this part of the world?
Well, yes. I mean, certainly that's a possible outcome is that the Quad will become stronger. I'm a realist as a geopolitical analyst, and I would say that that's one potential outcome. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize that if the main battle is going to be between, if you imagine a seesaw, China on one side and United States on the other side, India, the best geopolitical position for India to take is to be somewhere in the middle between China and the US, because then it can balance one against the other. And that's what all great powers have traditionally tried to do, to exploit divisions among other great powers. So India does have a choice. It could move closer to the Quad and move closer to the United States to counterbalance China. That's one realistic possibility. Or it could decide, hey, it's better for me to be in a middle position where I can balance ones against the other. These require very tough geopolitical decisions on the part of India. And if my guess is right, India wants to remain an independent, autonomous geopolitical actor and not be used by anybody else. That's my hunch about where India would go.
Sounds a bit like the non-aligned movement of the old days. Now, Kishore, the thing is, let's talk a little bit about the timing here as well. Why is this more aggressive foreign policy coming to bear now at a time when the world is in flux with the pandemic that they're dealing with?
I completely agree with you. Frankly, one of the oldest rules of geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's a very old rule of geopolitics. If COVID-19 is an enemy of the United States and COVID-19 is an enemy of China, US and China should logically be coming together to fight against COVID-19. The fact that it hasn't happened shows you how deep and profound this US-China geopolitical contest is. And as you know, in my book, Has China Won?, I point out the structural forces driving the US towards this contest. And sadly, the structural forces are so strong that even when they should be coming together to deal against COVID-19, and frankly, the results of COVID-19 also, US and China should be coming together to re-stimulate the global economy. That's what they should be doing. But they cannot do it because, as I say in my book, this US-China geopolitical contest has gained tremendous momentum and is rushing ahead in many ways, against rational considerations.
Kishore, when you talk about timing, maybe it's not that all surprising. Maybe China is stepping up to position itself for a post-pandemic world.
Yes and no. The China actually, as a country, China's priority today is to preserve stability, especially stability at home, because the Chinese, their per capita income is 10,000, United States is 60,000. There's still a big gap. The Chinese goal is to become a moderately prosperous country. To achieve that, they need stability at home and they need stability at their borders. So if the Chinese have an impulse, it's towards trying to preserve the stability. And to be fair, the US-China geopolitical contest was not launched by China. It was launched by the United States, especially after President Trump was elected, and he launched a trade war and he launched a technology war. So the Chinese, if they had a choice, they would try to postpone this and avoid this as long as possible. But of course, they don't have a choice.
How much of China's military and maritime ambitions has to do with it wanting to protect its trade routes?
I would say paradoxically, this is going to shock you, okay? The world's #1 trading power today already is China. And, most of the international seaways, they're Chinese products. And paradoxically, the Navy that is today protecting the seaways for Chinese trade is the United States Navy. Because it is the United States Navy is still the largest Navy in the world, is keeping international seaways open. And therefore, actually, frankly, the US Navy is providing Chinese trade a good service. But I guess the Chinese are also looking ahead. As you know, they've been subject to pressure from time to time from the US Navy, as in 1996 in the Taiwan Straits when Bill Clinton sent 2 aircraft carriers, or more recently in the South China Sea. So the Chinese buildup of the Navy is a logical response. But I think the Chinese do not have a kind of a global ambition to try and patrol the world seas lanes in the way that the United States has. Their ambitions in that sense are more modest, I think, than what the US Navy has.
Kishore, now you've been talking about your book, which you've cunningly put as a marketing ploy over your right shoulder, and you're posing the question, has China won? Number one, what's your answer to that in the book? And number two, isn't it a bit early to be asking that question?
Well, if I gave you the answer to the question, you won't buy the book, right? But let me tell you.
Just answer it, Kishore.
The answer is no. Well, or more accurately, not yet. But at the same time, I mean, the tragedy is that, I begin the book by describing a one-on-one lunch I had with Henry Kissinger in his private club in New York in March 2018. And it was from Henry Kissinger that I got the most important insight for my book, which is that the United States has launched a major geopolitical contest against China without first working out a comprehensive long-term strategy. And of course, that's always a mistake. And I quote also George Kennan a lot in the book. And George Kennan was the man who formulated America's strategy against Soviet Union. In some ways, a much smaller opponent than China is. And, he gave very valuable pieces of advice. He says you must strengthen your domestic vitality, your domestic economy. You must cultivate friends and allies. You must be humble. You mustn't insult your adversaries. And tragedy, the tragedy here is that the Trump administration has been ignoring the valuable advice of America's greatest strategic thinkers like Kissinger and Kennan. So my book is actually in some ways quite helpful to the United States in trying to point out that before you embark on this great geopolitical contest with the world's oldest civilization, which is 4,000 years old, maybe you should first work out a strategy. And that's why, many thoughtful Americans have reacted positively to my book and said, thank you very much for writing it. Because at the end of the day, my goal is to prevent this major geopolitical contest, which will damage not just US and China, but damage us in Southeast Asia and, frankly, also damage us in Singapore.